I was punished by another spell in the special block, and I was there when Alexandrescu called specially to inform me that the American president had been assassinated. "What do you have to say about that?" he inquired. I said, "I can't believe it." He showed me a newspaper which reported Mr. Kennedy's death in a single paragraph. "Well," he insisted. Pursuing questions of this sort was part of the technique to discover how prisoners' minds were working. When I replied that if Kennedy were a Christian, then he was happy now in heaven, Alexandrescu walked out. Later I was in a cell with Father Andricu when the guards came for us. We were blindfolded and handcuffed before being let out. For all we knew, it might have been to execution. The guard said, "Turn right here," and "Now turn left." In a distant part of the prison, our blindfolds came off. We were in a suite of clean, warm offices. Andricu was taken off to another part of what must have been the central administration section. I remained outside a door, alone with the guard, who in the past had listened when I spoke quietly of Christ. He whispered, "My poor friend, you're having a hard time, but in God's name, go on." He moved some paces away, his face blank, but his words warmed me. When the door opened, I was led into the presence of a man in general's uniform. It was Negria, the deputy minister of the Interior, whose intelligence was matched by the energy burning in his strong gypsy face. The political officer and some officials from Bucharest sat beside him. Negria said politely, "I've been studying your case, Mr. Wurmbrand. I don't care for your views, but I like a man who sticks to his guns. We communists are obstinate too. I've often been in prison myself, and plenty was done to make me change my mind, but I stood firm. I believe it's time we met halfway. If you're prepared to forget what you've suffered, we'd forget what you've done against us. We could turn the page and become friends instead of enemies. So far from acting against your own convictions, you could act upon them and still enter a period of fruitful cooperation." A file lay open before him. "I've even read your sermons. The explanations of the Bible are beautifully put, but you must realize we live in a scientific age." "What now?" I asked myself as Negria went into the party's science lecture. Had an important minister come 200 miles for this? Like the Danube, which twists and turns through the plains but reaches the sea at last, his discourse came to an end. "We need men like you. We don't want people to join us out of opportunism or because they see the fallacies in their past thinking. If you are prepared to help us in the struggle against superstition, you can start a new life at once. You will have a post with a high salary and your family around you again in comfort and in safety. What do you say?" I replied that I found joy in the life I was already leading, but as for helping the party, I had thought of a way of doing so if I were released. The political officer sat up. Negria said, "You mean you'll work for us?" "I suggest that you send me from town to town and village to village along with the best Marxist teacher you have. First, I shall expose my ignorance and the stupidities of my retrograde Christian religion. Then your Marxist can explain his theories, and the people will be able to make up their own minds between the two." Negria gave me a hard stare. "You're provoking us, Mr. Wurmbrand. That is what I like about you. It's just the way we communists used to answer the bosses in the old days. So let's not argue. I'll make you a better proposal still. Nobody wants you to become an atheist propagandist. If you're really so attached to an outworn faith, though I can't understand how a cultured man can accept such nonsense, then keep to it. But also keep in mind that we have the power. Communism has conquered a third of the world. The church must come to terms with us. Let's put our cards on the table for once. Frankly, we're tired of church leaders who do everything we ask, and sometimes more. They've compromised themselves in the eyes of the people. They're no longer in touch with what's going on. One by one, Negria listed the remaining bishops. All were powerless, he said, or party men, and everyone knew it. Now, if a man like you became a bishop, you could have your faith and still be loyal to the regime. Your Bible says you should submit to authority because it comes from God, so why not to ours? I said nothing. Negria asked the other officials to leave us alone for a moment. He was convinced that I would accept the offer and gave me his confidence on something he did not want the others to hear. The party made a mistake, he began, in attacking your World Council of Churches. It began as a spy ring, but the pastors concerned are often of proletarian origin. They aren't shareholders, so to speak, but superior servants. Instead of opposing such men, we should win them over to our side so that the council itself becomes our instrument. He leant over the desk. Mr. Wurmbrand, this is where you can help. You've worked for the World Council of Churches. You're known widely abroad. We still get many inquiries about you. If you became a bishop, you could help our other WCC allies to build a bulwark for us, not of atheism, but of socialism and peace. Surely you recognize the universal idealism behind our campaigns to ban the bomb and outlaw war. And you'll be able to worship to your heart's content. There we won't interfere. I thought for a moment. How far must this cooperation go? Bishops who worked with you in the past have had to inform on their own priests. Will I be expected to do that too? Negria began to laugh. You'd be under no special obligation by virtue of your office, he said. Everyone who knows of any act which may harm the state is obliged to denounce the man who does, and as a bishop you'll certainly hear such things. The present Lutheran bishop of Romania is very old. You'd be bishop-elect and effective head of your church in Romania from the start. I asked for time to reflect, and Negria agreed. We'll meet again before I leave for Bucharest to put your release papers through, he said. I was taken back to an isolation cell and lay thinking for many hours. I remembered the old Jewish story of another man who asked for time to think. A rabbi, facing the Inquisition, was asked to deny his faith. Next morning, the rabbi said, I will not turn Catholic, but I make one last request, that before I'm burnt at the stake, my tongue should be cut out for not replying at once. To such question, no was the only answer. But that was only one side of the case. On the other, I knew that the official church in a communist country can survive only through some compromise. Even by paying taxes to an atheist state, a Christian compromises. It was easy to say the church could go underground, but an underground church needs cover for its work. Lacking this cover, millions of people would be left with nowhere to meet for worship, no pastor to preach, no one to baptize them, marry them, bury their dead. An unthinkable alternative, when I could help to avoid it by saying a few words in favor of collectivization or the so-called peace campaigns. And then I had not seen my wife and child for years. I did not know if they were alive. The police officer had said that Sabina was in prison. What would become of her and Mihai if I refused this proposal? I needed strength from above to say no, when doing so meant serving 11 more years with the sacrifice of my family and almost certain death under terrible conditions. But at that moment, God's face was veiled, and my faith failed me. I saw before me the huge shape of communism, which already covered so much of the world and threatened to cover the rest as well. And my imagination was overcome by the danger of dying and being beaten again and again, and the hunger and privations to which I was condemning my wife and son. My soul was like a ship driven from side to side, rocked by a violent tempest, one moment plunged into the abyss, the next carried up to heaven. I drank in those hours the cup of Christ. It was for me the Garden of Gethsemane. And, like Jesus, I threw myself with face upon the earth and prayed with broken cries and asked God to help me overcome this horrible temptation. After prayer, I felt a little quieter. but still I saw before me Nikifor, Dianu, and Radu Ginda, and so many others who harmed the faith, including the patriarch. They numbered thousands, and now I had become a man mean in faith, and I would be swallowed up like them for my weakness of the flesh. I began to think carefully of all the times I had argued the truth of Christianity. I repeated to myself the simplest questions. Is the way of love better than hatred? Has Christ lifted the burden of sin and doubt from my shoulders? Is he the Savior? There was no difficulty eventually in answering yes. And when I had done so, it was as if a great weight had been removed from my mind. For a long time I remained in the special block. How long I am not sure. Time has telescoped all days of certain periods in my prison life into one enormous day. The brainwashing increased in its intensity, but changed little in method. The loudspeakers now said, "Christianity is dead. Christianity is dead. Christianity is dead." I recall one day clearly. They had given us postcards to invite our families to come and bring parcels. On the day named, I was shaved and washed and given a clean shirt. Hours passed. I sat in the cell staring at the glittering white tiles, but no one came. Evening brought only a change of guard. I was not to know then that my postcard had never been sent, and the same trick was played on other stubborn prisoners. The loudspeaker said, "Nobody loves you now. Nobody loves you now. Nobody loves you now." I began to weep. The loudspeaker said, "They don't want to know you anymore. They don't want to know you anymore. They don't want to know you anymore." I could not bear to hear these words, and I could not shut them out. Next day brought a brutal struggle meeting confined to the disappointed men. Plenty of other wives had come, the lecturer said. We were the fools. We had been abandoned. Our womenfolk were in bed with other men at that very moment. He described what was happening between them with all the obscenity at his command. And where were our children? Out in the streets, atheists, everyone. They had no wish to see their fathers. How stupid we were. In the special block, I listened to the speaker day after day. Christianity is dead. Christianity is dead. Christianity is dead. And in time, I came to believe what they had told us for all those months. Christianity was dead. The Bible foretells a time of great apostasy, and I believed that it had arrived. Then I thought of Mary Magdalene, and perhaps this thought, more than any other, helped to save me from the soul-killing poison of the last and worst stage of brainwashing. I remembered how faithful she was to Christ, even when he cried on the cross, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And when he was a corpse in the tomb, she wept nearby and waited until he arose. So when I believed at last that Christianity was dead, I said, "Even so, I will believe in it, and I will weep at its tomb until it arises again, as it surely will." In June 1964, all prisoners were gathered in the main hall. The commandant entered with his officers, and we prepared for a new stage in the struggle campaign. Instead, Major Alexandrescu announced that under the terms of a general amnesty granted by the government, political prisoners of every kind were to be freed. I could not believe it. Looking around, I saw blankness on every face. Then Alexandrescu shouted an order, and the entire hall broke into cheers. If he had told them, "Tomorrow you will all be shot," they still would have cheered and cried, "Quite right, we don't deserve to live." The announcement was not, as we first thought, another trick. The summer of that year saw the release of innumerable thousands of prisoners. For this we had to thank another so-called thaw between East and West, and also, though I did not know it at the time, a true change of heart in our Prime Minister, Gheorghiu Dej. After many years of doubting communist dogma, he had returned to the faith in which his mother had raised him and kept all her life. Desh had been converted through a maidservant in his home, and her uncle, a good old man who often spoke to him of the Bible. Christianity, although he did not confess it openly, gave him the strength to defy his Soviet masters. Ignoring their threats, he opened new relations with the West, and in doing so, set an example to other captive countries. Unhappily, he died a few months later, his end being hastened, it is said, by Soviet agents. My turn came for release. I found myself among one of the last groups of 100 or so men gathered in the big hall. We were almost the last prisoners left in Gerla. A strange silence had descended on the corridors. Our hair was cut, and we were given worn but quite clean clothes. While I wondered what had become of the original odor of the suit I wore, I heard a man called, "Brother Wurmbrand." He came up and said he was from Sibiu, so I supposed that he was a member of our church there. "I've heard so much of you from your son," he added. "We shared a cell together." I said, "My son? In prison?" No, you're mistaken." "You mean you didn't know?" the man went on. "He's been in jail 6 years now." I turned away and he left me. The blow was almost more than I could bear. Mihai's health had not been good. It would never stand up to the strain of prolonged prison life. My mind was still frozen with pain and shock when Commandant Alexandrescu came up. "Well, Wurmbrand," he asked in a curious tone, "where will you go now that you are free?" I replied, "I don't know. I've been told officially that my wife is in prison, and now I hear my only son is, too. I have nobody else." Alexandrescu shrugged. "The boy, too. How do you feel having a jailbird for a son?" "I am sure he is not in jail for theft or any other crime, and if he is there for Christ's sake, then I am proud of him." "What?" he shouted. "We spend all this money keeping you for years, and you think it's something to be proud of to have a family in prison for such things." "I did not want you to spend anything on me," I said. So we parted. I walked out of the prison in another man's clothes. The streets of Gerla seemed dazzling. Cars roared past, and I started nervously. The colors of a woman's coat, of a bunch of flowers, shocked my eyes. Music from a radio, coming through an open window, had a texture rich as oversweetened coffee. The air smelt clean and new, as if the hay was being carted beyond the confines of the little town. But everything was saddened by the thought of my wife and son in prison. I went by bus to the nearby town of Cluj, where I had friends, but they had moved. I tramped from one house to another in sweltering midsummer heat until I found them at last. They brought out cake and fruit, all manner of good things. But there was a beautiful brown onion on the table, and it was that I wanted. I had hankered so often for an onion to take away the taste of prison food. Now I did not like to ask for it. I made a telephone call to a neighbor of ours in Bucharest. The voice that answered was Sabina's. "It's Richard," I said. "I thought you were in prison." There was a confused noise. Mihai came on the line. "Mother's fainted. Hold on." There were more strange sounds. Then he said, "She's all right. We thought you were dead." Mihai had never been in prison. The false news I had been given was a last turn of the screw to test my reactions to brainwashing. I took the train to Bucharest. As it drew into the station, I saw a crowd of men, women, and children. Their arms were full of flowers, and I wondered what lucky person was receiving such a welcome. Then I recognized faces, and I leaned from the window of the carriage to wave. As I climbed down, it seemed as if all the people of our church were running to meet me, and then my arms were around my wife and son. That night, Sabina told me she'd been given news of my death years before. She refused to believe it, even when strangers called on her who claimed to be ex-prisoners who had attended my burial. "I will wait for him," she said. The years passed and no word came until my telephone call. It was for her as if I had been resurrected from the dead. One Sunday, months after my release, I took a group of skilled school children for a walk. The secret police dogged us first, but seeing that we went into the zoo, they left us. I led the children to the lion's cage and gathered them around so that I might speak quietly. I said, "Your forefathers in the Christian faith were thrown to wild beasts like these. They died gladly because they believed in Jesus. The time may come when you also will be imprisoned and suffer for being a Christian. Now you must decide whether you are ready to face that day." With tears in their eyes, each in turn said yes. I asked no other questions in this, the last confirmation class I held before leaving my country. I have described in the preface why I decided that I must leave my country and how I came to the West. Now I have only this to add. On the wall of a civic building in Washington, D.C., there is a large plaque containing the Constitution of the United States, skillfully engraved in copper plate. When you first look at it, you see only the engraved words of the Constitution. Then, on stepping back, so that the angle of the light changes, the face of George Washington appears, carved into the text. So it should be with this book, which contains episodes from a man's life and the story of those who were with him in prison. Behind them all stands an unseen being, Christ, who kept us in faith and gave us strength to conquer.